So I'm an associate professor of psychology at the University of Northampton. We have three main research groups within psychology there, looking at education, child and adolescent mental health, but also parapsychology within a group called EECS, which is perfect for eeks and boo and spooky stuff, exceptional experiences and consciousness studies. So it's a group of scholars interested in parapsychology, transpersonal psychology, religious and peak experiences, consciousness studies, cognitive psychology and neuroscience. It's mainly made up of a lot of parapsychologists and PhD candidates. We've got a lot of people coming to us doing studies, doing their PhDs on a variety of wonderful different things. I've got about 10 or 11 PhD candidates that I'm supervising at the moment, and they're covering topics such as after-death communication experiences amongst the bereaved and the elderly in some instances, looking at it from a counselling perspective. We've just had a student complete looking at dietary practice, so vegetarianism, veganism and fasting, versus what does this mean to the population? Why do they actually favour such a diet, and how do they believe that influences any psychic experiences they have? He went and interviewed people that claim mediumship and psychic abilities, and Uri Geller was one of the interviewees that I put him in touch with. He then did lab studies based on this as well to see who actually does better at a psychic-based task depending on their dietary practice. One of my students is looking at the flotation tanks to see if while you're in a flotation tank, about an hour in darkness, in salty water, naked, floating around with all these visions coming to you, do those visions inside the tank relate to a target somewhere on a computer? And can you actually predict them before they actually happen? We've got projects looking at psychic photography as well from an art-based perspective rather than psychology. We've got mediumship projects, two twin PhDs where one student is looking at what it's like to be a medium and a developing medium from the viewpoint of the medium, and the other from the viewpoint of the sitters at spiritualist churches as well. So we're involved in a number of things. Parapsychology, to define it, is the study of human experiences and abilities which, if they are as they seem to be, are in principle outside of the realms of conventional science. So we're trying to fill in the gaps. The para in psychology just means beyond. So we've got biological psychology, cognitive psychology, child psychology, evolutionary psychology, you name it. This strand is looking at, well, what about when people have, let's say, an experience of the telephone rings or your text message pings, and you're thinking of someone you don't regularly contact, and it turned out to be them. Hands up, how many of you have experienced that? Pretty much most of you, about 80 to 90% on that one. So parapsychology will be interested in that. Why? What are the conventional explanations for that? Could you actually put that to the test in the lab? Could you get a group of people, and one of them is randomly selected to make the call, and another person, when the phone rings, has to say the name before they answer? What about being in a public place? You're sat in Leicester Square, you're just eating a sandwich, and you're fidgeting a bit, and you decide to just stop taking that next bite and look around, and lo and behold, out of the crowd, someone is looking in your direction. Could have been at the back of your head, at the back of your body, could have been in a library, anywhere else, any public place. Hands up, how many of you can relate to that at least once? That's about 65, 70, so again, very popular. How, why can we put that to the test? Can we do a field study and go and copy the same condition? Can we do a lab study as well? People claiming haunting phenomena, people claiming mediumship, children talking about past lives and other families. These are all things that parapsychology will be interested in. And it came about as a science in the 1800s. So 1848, the Fox sisters were making their claims of spirit raps and communication with the dead. There's a whole story to all of that, and the back and forth about their claims that they made it up, and then actually they were telling the truth, and it was just a whole media frenzy really with the whole duration of what happened to the Fox sisters and the idea of clicking toes inside their shoes causing the phenomena. But this sparked many other people to come forward and claim the same abilities. Same thing happened when Uri Geller was popular with the spoon bending. We called them mini Gellers. Other people came forward claiming they could bend metal as well and produce other feats. But by the end of the 1800s, the newspaper reports on hauntings and apparitions, people holding seances in private homes, a group of scholars got together at Trinity College, Cambridge University, and formed the Society for Psychical Research in 1882. People like Frederick Myers, Henry Sidgwick, Edmund Gurney, and many others, really distinguished scholars of philosophy, psychology, and developing physics. And in 1884-85, the American branch was formed by people like William James, and again, many other noted scholars. But their remit was to try and say, well, we think we've already got the conventional explanations for what's going on here. So they were more so trying to dispute the British SPR that's based in Kensington, still going to this day. And within 10 years or so, studying these mediums, studying these cases of apparitions, they realised that it doesn't seem that every conventional explanation we've got right now seems to fit the bill. So they started working in conjunction all the way through the decades with the British SPR. Then came the university setting. Parapsychology ended up there in the 1920s. Harvard University had done some successful tests of ESP. London University had also got Harry Price, the famous ghost hunter. That's why I was late, I was at the College of Psychic Studies where he had his lab, the National Laboratory for Psychical Research, on the top floor after he'd fallen out with the British SPR. He tested Eileen Garrett there, the Irish medium, who then emigrated to the United States and formed the Parapsychology Foundation in 1951. And so London had tried it, Harvard had tried it, but Duke University, Joseph Banks Rhine and Louisa Rhine, PhDs in botany, they were scooped up by William McDougall, who gained a deanery there and said, I want you to form your own psychical research lab, but rebrand it. Rebrand it from psychic research, call it something else. So they took the German term of parapsychology and started doing formal, systematic tests of ESP. And they'd not used that term before, extrasensory perception. It was the title of Rhine's first monograph, looking at all the main statistics for these card-guessing exercises. And so originally they were using playing cards, but they worked with professors of perceptual study. Carl Zener was one of them, or Zener, and that's where the Zener cards came about. Your circle, your cross, your wavy line, your square, your star. You've got 5 of those in every pack, so it's a 5 out of 25 chance that you're going to get those right. But what if people get 9, 13, 15 or more out of 25, and consistently so? They're beating what chance expects. Maybe it's due to sleight of hand and shuffling them in a particular sequence. So let's stick them in envelopes, but you can't see what's going to be the next one. What about using electric card shufflers so there's no sleight of hand anymore? What about shielding people against seeing the experimenter, and many other things? They brought in all these safeguards that social science now uses to this day, all the randomization and shielding and testing for significance levels. Most studies in psychology try to beat a 1 in 20 chance that something's going on. Parapsychology was starting with a greater level. Can you beat 1 in 200? So they were doing the most sophisticated tests, and as much as there's outside popular skepticism that has said these kinds of stats were disputed, they really weren't. I haven't seen anything that shows the basic statistics, such as how do you show 5 out of 25 and significance levels can be beaten. It's not been disputed. It's very basic stats, and they worked with the mathematicians there. Field studies, still looking for ghosts, still looking for the best medium. The reason that Rhine ended up doing all of that and working at Duke University was a fallout with a medium that the American SPR have been looking into called Mina Crandon. And because in certain seance conditions, some members of the ASPR believed that sexual favours were being offered within the dark for good reports, and 50% of the ASPR just wanted nothing to do with this. There's some very suspicious photographs post-seance with her skirt cut very high and her husband, who was a doctor of chemistry, I think, full well knowing what was going on and promoting this because she was getting a lot of popularity out of it. So this caused a major split. But you've got these individual investigators going out, still doing the haunting investigations, still doing other things. By 1950, where this kind of journey started, Raymond Bayless was a landscape painter. His paintings are pretty famous still in California. And he did some of the first paintings for War of the Worlds, doing the long-legged robots walking over the earth and shooting lasers down. And he'd done some formal experiments. He'd rented a studio, soundproofed it, and worked with an astral projector, self-professed psychic, called Attila Vonzele. And in this soundproof room, they would have a reel-to-reel recorder, put it in a soundproof box, hit record, and they'd sit there in silence, with the idea that Attila Vonzele is going to get the spirits to put impression onto tape. Voices, raps. On playback, indeed, they got scratching and knocks and raps. And there was no conventional explanation for it as far as they could see. They published it in the Journal of the American Society for Psychical Research in January 1959, just as a letter to editor, and no one paid attention to it. Parapsychologists weren't interested. This was bridging survival, the idea of survival after death, with electrical equipment. No one was really interested in that. They'd only really heard about apparitions and mediumship, and that was really it. And so it went by the wayside. Raymond Bayless continued to look into this phenomena, and other people did as well. That brought many figures out of the woodwork, and he started to tutor a young D. Scott Rogo, Douglas Scott Rogo. By the age of 14, 15, he was out ghost hunting with friends at school and reading popular magazines, had an early interest in vampires, but he got involved in some of these studies as well. By the age of 16, he was publishing his first reports on electronic voice phenomena in the Journal of Paraphysics, marking everything that needed to be done in his method. We got fresh tapes, they got foil on them, so we took the foil off to show that it was a brand new tape and it had never been used before or recorded over, everything in detail. By the 1970s, they got a few letters and mentions from people saying, oh, you're doing these recordings allegedly from spirit, maybe you're interested in my case. I've heard of someone claiming they've had a telephone call from the dead. They didn't really mock it, but they just weren't interested because they'd never heard of anyone mention this before. And so they carried on with their work, but more people were starting to mention, have you heard of the telephones doing this? Or have you read that book? There's a mention of a telephone call in that. So they thought, we need to look at this. How many cases can we find? So by the mid-1970s, they started to look into this. And by 1977, they gave their full attention to it for 2 years. Their first book on this was published in 1979, simply called Phone Calls from the Dead, that went to 3 editions. It was that popular. And they'd found 50 cases of unusual experiences. When they advertised for them, it wasn't for strange experiences related to the dead. They said, any strange experience you've had with the telephone, we would like to know about it. And so then they analysed them. In social science, we call it a content analysis. Thematic analysis as well is a way around that they worked. Looking at popular themes and characteristics, how can we actually read these accounts and start to categorise them and sort them? And they found 4 different types of calls when they looked at this. One was simple calls. And so that was, you knew someone had died, you were sat at home alone, the telephone rings, you pick it up and you hear the sound of static, or a very faint and hollow voice might say your name, something similar to that, and you don't hear the telephone click, you don't hear it go down. And that's it. So what happened there? Type 2 calls, prolonged. You get a call from your friend Mary. Hello Mary, and she talks about various projects that you're doing and all sorts, and maybe you're writing a book project together, and she said, oh, you finished the book off, I've done my bit, you've got this now, you can finish it off, the project's in your hands, I think I need a break, I'm going away now. Saying a lot of things very final. You don't really take much note of it, but the call goes as normal, so far as you think it has. And then there's a knock at the door after the call, it's David. David seems really upset and distressed. What's wrong, David? Didn't you hear about Mary yesterday? Well, I've just been on the phone to her. What happened to Mary yesterday? You can't have been on the phone to her. She died yesterday in a car accident. Check with the call company, and there's no record of that call taking place, but there is of all the other calls. In some instances, there are multiple witnesses to that person taking the call. So what's going on there? Type 3, answer calls. This is where you're the one making the call. So you could get a prolonged call. You don't know someone's died, and still it's prolonged. The deceased answers, and you find out afterwards they couldn't possibly have made it. Or someone you know answers the phone, and yet later is verified to have been elsewhere at the time of that call. So they couldn't have answered. When you mention the call later, or it's mentioned amongst friends, it's an impossibility seemingly, because at that time they were completely somewhere else and being watched by other people who could verify they did not take the call. But someone did, with their voice, characteristics and knowledge to carry out a prolonged call. And the final one they found was intention calls, where you intend to make a telephone call, but you change your mind at the last minute. And maybe this could answer why people also see apparitions of living people as well. You would never know that you really have, unless like in Ghostbusters, when Egon's going around the hotel for their first ghost capture, you go up and you actually poke people and actually check, are they there? But things seem to tie together later on, like when you say, I saw you earlier in Sainsbury's. No, you didn't. Yeah, you're wearing your favourite coat and stuff, and you got your hair tied back in that bobble you usually wear. Is definitely you out earlier. No, I was with my friends earlier. Well, then you've got a twin. You've got a twin living in the same town. How often do we hear that as well? But what's going on there? Yeah, someone can relate to it. A few of you seem to be able to relate with the nod. Of course, that seems to happen as well. This is why people like Professor Bernard Carr, who was one of Stephen Hawking's students, he's a vice president of the Society for Psychical Research. His viewpoint is that physics could explain a lot of these experiences due to multiverse. The idea that we have these multiple dimensions and maybe they interplay with our experiences rather than it being the mind creating a psychic experience. So as they came up with this intention call type, Raymond Bayless and Scott Rogo recognised some of these themselves. Scott had one, and this is it verbatim. It was 10 o'clock on a bright Thursday morning, and I thought about making a call to a friend of mine at the UCLA Neuropsychiatric Institute. Although I thought about making the call, I never actually did. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, though, I got the shock of my life when the call came in to me from them, from the very office of the psychologist I thought about calling. It was their research assistant saying that he was answering my message. When I asked what in blazes he was talking about, he said that at 10 o'clock that morning, a call had come into them from me. The caller had left my name, my number, and asked that the call be returned. So that's what those experiences are like. So they did that. They published a book. They looked a little bit into the history as far as they could. In the 1920s, there were various people trying to make telephones to contact the dead. Thomas Edison showed interest in this, but there was no evidence that he ever actually did. He even did an interview to Scientific America saying that he was making such a device, but there were many people that claimed that they had, and it was successful. My hometown of Nottingham, where I've come from today, F.R. Melton, he claimed that he had a psychic telephone. He'd done a few publications for the College of Psychic Studies on this. The second prototype even contained a balloon with his son's breath in it, claiming that it has the psychic ether. His son was very sceptical, but when he walked into a seance one evening, the activity heightened relating to his deceased fiancée. So his father said, help me build a second telephone, since he was a radio and telephone engineer for the military. And he said, I need to take you with me somehow. So he filled this balloon with his breath, and it's a very basic box. And later on it was developed so it had a speaker on it, so you could take it to groups of people like this and everybody could hear. But it's shrouded in mystery. I always like to say, when I show designs of this and I show the balloon, I ask people, what do you think's in that? And they'll go, oh, helium. And I give the joke, I used to work in a helium balloon factory, but I won't be spoken to in that tone of voice. So I left. They just find it absolutely weird that this device has never surfaced, and many others like it as well. But when I've looked into his history, I went through the newspaper archives for Nottingham. He got arrested a few times as a political activist. He'd been arrested and sent before a magistrate's court for fleeing from his family and parental duties and faking his own death. He was a member of the Cosmo Debating Society in Nottingham and often boasted having a Bachelor of Science in Engineering from Birmingham University. I checked with Birmingham University, they have no record of him completing a BSc or even being there. It could stand for Bronze Swimming Certificate, and he's just putting that after his name. Doesn't seem to be an entirely honest guy, and yet he's professing to make a telephone to contact the dead. I couldn't find his main booklet about the instructions for making it anywhere. It wasn't in London, it wasn't in Nottingham. It was a private printing company in Nottingham. It wasn't until I was in San Francisco in 2019 in Scott Rogo's archive at the California Institute for Integral Studies. I'd gone through 42 boxes of letter correspondence, and in an envelope, sure enough, there was a photocopied example of that booklet with a rusted staple on it. I had to quickly go through it and check that I could copy some of that out, because I'd never seen it before. So their book went by the way. It got reviewed a few times, 4 popular reviews, positive, 2 negative ones, where people didn't like the whole idea of it because it was very quirky, it was very new, people talking on the telephone to the dead. Also, has it been done in a scientific capacity? They've not submitted it as a peer-reviewed paper. It's more a sciencey type book. They wrote about it in a later book. Scott had a book called Is There Life After Death and did a chapter on it. Raymond Bayless did one too, called The Case for Life After Death, Parapsychologists Look at the Evidence, in 1981. Tiny chapter on it, nothing more. So in 2009, when I was an undergraduate, I was buying loads of Scott Rogo's books and Raymond Bayless's, and that's when I stumbled across their co-written piece. But I didn't read it. I'd seen on MSN News at the Times that there'd been a train collision in California, a freight train with a commuter train, and a gentleman called Charles Peck had been involved in the collision, and his family were claiming that up until 3 a.m. they were getting repeated calls from him on their mobile phones. And they were saying, don't worry, Dad, the rescuers are coming. And every time they put down the phone, it would ring again, and they'd just hear static. If they rang back, it would just go to voicemail, as though the phone was broken or the battery had died. And at 3 a.m., there was live kind of rescue feed on the TV or something like that, or on the radio. They found his body. He was near the front of the train. He died on first impact, and the phone was never recovered. The scepticism in me is that, well, it's calling the last people in your call register. You're going home. It's your wife. It's your children. And it's just been crushed, and it's just going on repeat until it dies. But the media have widely publicised it as a telephone call from the dead. And that perked my interest to go and read the original book. What cases are they dealing with? And lo and behold, they're full of conversations, not just ringing phones. So what's going on there? So I started to ask out. This is when iPhones were starting to become popular. We're starting to use the internet on our phone. We would use them for sat-navs, as best as they were at the time, around about 2009. And people were telling me about text messages and emails from the dead. So I started to write some basic articles on it, collect more cases, got in touch with the California Institute for Integral Studies. They sent me some of Scott's unpublished cases. I did an analysis of 50 cases. So after I'd done 2 peer-reviewed papers, I wrote the book, and then I published the analysis as well. I'll give you some examples of what were at the time some unpublished accounts in Scott's files that came after their book. I like this one, it's a nice oldie-worldy one. I cannot remember the exact year because it has been so long ago, but at any rate, my grandmother had one of those old war phones, the ones with a crank that you had to call so many shorts and longs for various individuals. My grandmother and I would often walk the 1.25 miles to town and back, always leaving her doors open. Whether someone took advantage of this situation is not known. However, her phone bill was higher than usual, and we walked to her neighbour and she offered him the nickel to call to Central. They called the operator Central in those days. He refused the money and said just use it. She called concerning a call that we received early in the night before. She asked why the phone was not disconnected, as she asked earlier in the week. The operator went through her papers and said, Mrs. Sayer, that was disconnected, for I have the order before me and signed by the lineman. My grandmother said, it couldn't be. I received a call from Lizzie Partlet in Parksboro, West Virginia, saying that she was going away, but that everything was all right and that she could only say a few words, and said, you will hear in a few days. Her voice seemed so hollow and had a faraway manner about it, yet she could hear every word. The lineman came out in the evening and climbed the pole. He pointed out to my grandmother the new white wire that was wound around the pole and not connected. Then he went up to the house and pointed out the wire there also disconnected. He explained that the other wire connected to a lightning arrestor for safety's sake. Mrs. Sayer, this line could not operate broken in 2 places. Only one break in the line is sufficient. My grandmother insisted that it did, and he looked as if one doubting her sanity, mumbled a few words and said it wouldn't happen again in his opinion. In about 3 days she received a letter from the Partlet family saying that Mrs. Partlet had died in the early night of the day before the letter was written. Mail travelled slow even by train in those days, and living on a rural route caused it to be even later. The impossible call was made at time she passed away, and has remained a mystery ever since. I remember quite well, and I just put a couple of pictures up to it. There was a gentleman called Carl, or a young guy called Carl, who'd had some sort of relationship trouble, and he just wants to clear his head, just get away for the night, get away from family and friends. And he goes out to the coast and looks immediately for a B&B to stay in, and finds one that says vacancy available, knocks on the door, and a lovely old lady answers and said, yep, I've got a room free, just call me Grandma, everybody calls me Grandma. Shows him up to the room, and it's perfect, just what he needs, quiet, out the way, view of the beach, full of antiques, beautiful room. So he puts down his things and he goes for a walk on the beach. And he's clearing his head, skimming some stones. And he comes back and he's getting ready for bed. And he's just untying his shoe when the telephone in the room rings. So he stops what he's doing and he goes to answer the telephone. And it's his dad. Ah, Carl, there you are. Your mother's been looking for you. Be sure to speak to her, okay? Well, Dad, surely you're with her right now. Just call her to the phone. Oh, she's not with me right now. Well, where are you? I'm in a beautiful place, but be sure to call your mother. And that was it. No click of the phone, nothing. The phone has just gone dead in a very subtle way of silence. So he puts the phone back down and picks it up and tries to get through to the operator, but there's nothing. There's no dial tone, there's nothing. So he's still stressed from what's happened during the day, and he carries on doing what he's doing, undoes his shoes and gets ready for bed. The next morning down at breakfast, he tells Grandma about the experience that he had, about a strange telephone call from his dad. She said, you've not received a telephone call in that room. He said, I did on the phone. She said, have you not seen the whole room? It's full of antiques that my late husband bought. It's a relic of years gone by. There's no wiring in that phone. It's just fixed to the wall as a display. You best call your mother. Hands him a modern yellow kitchen phone, and on the first ring she answers, Carl, where have you been? Your father died of a heart attack at 11 o'clock last night. We've all been frantic trying to find where you are. Finishes up what he's doing, packs his bags, and goes home. So that's what those calls are like. So the only difference that I found was when I looked at 50 cases, I found mixed calls. I found some very unique cases where people knew someone to be dead and yet had repeated calls from them over time. The one that was reported to me was by a guy I referred to as Dr Jones, who became a doctor of social science later on in life, was interested in parapsychology, even applied for a few positions but never pursued that path, but partly because of his experience. His mother's kind of early childhood sweetheart had died. She regularly spoke to him on the kitchen phone she'd take through to the bathroom, had a long cable on it, and he called 2 to 3 times a week. But after he died, at the time that he would normally call, a call comes through and she just goes and answers the phone, comes back through to the family, white as a sheet. What's happened, Mum? Are you okay? Richard phoned. And it happened 2 to 3 times a week for the next 3 years. It carried on. And this is the 1960s. Do you call fire, police, ambulance, the Ghostbusters? No one knew about psychical research really, or that universities would be interested in it, so they just accepted that it was happening. I'm surprised how many cases there are where people do just accept apparitions. I've known friends and colleagues locally, I won't go into too much detail, but with a farmhouse that I know, where someone had gone into the attic and seen someone else up there, a 6-foot-tall gentleman, went down to the family and said, "What on earth's going on? Was it one of you two, one of his sons? Had they gone up and spooked him?" He said, "No, we've all been down here. What have you just seen?" Describes the man in the attic, and his wife says, "Oh yeah, that's Bob. I see him all the time. I thought you did too." No. How long has this been going on for? For the last 3 or 4 years. The fact that they knew that this person wasn't quite real, but certainly is there, so no one's bothered to mention it, because what are you going to do about it? I find it fascinating when you get people that get to that kind of mindset, and they're very sceptical, very rational people, but you're clearly having this experience, so just assume everyone else is too, and eventually it seems other people are. You're in the right place at the right time. So that was a mixed call, going back to that with Dr. Jones. It happened over and over and over again, but they knew this person was dead. What do you do? He remembers one time the phone rang while his mother was out, picks it up, and hears the sound of wind and static, just like Rogo and Bayless found as a call characteristic, and he just shouted, "She's not here!" and put the phone down. And he said he wishes he'd never done that, so he could actually find out what that voice sounded like when she was having a call. After she died, he found all of her diaries, where she got really extensive ones of just day-to-day thoughts. And when he looked back through it, and I've seen scans of it, it just says, Thursday, my darling called to say that he loved me and would always be at my side. He calls to give me comfort, and I ask him to help me sleep, and he says, "Now you will sleep." And I sleep better that night. Goodbye, my darling. I'll speak to you soon. Next call. My darling called again to say that he's watching over me. It's nothing specific, nothing useful except for words of love and comfort. If it's a prank, the fact that someone is sticking to that 2 to 3 times a week, over and over again, why? What's going on there? The motive is a bit flaky as to why, but the scepticism should be there. But it's an odd one where they're not doing it to scare or to upset. The person's clearly gaining comfort from it, as most people do with after-death communications, but what on earth is going on? What's caused that? Where's it coming from? What could the line operator have told us if we looked at the phone bill or the telephone system? That would have been really useful, but it's so long ago. And that's the problem with apparition cases and many more. They come and go. They're past tense, so we're left with anecdotes. But when you have more than one anecdote, you have data. And so then you can actually look at what's going on in this group of stories. You could even go back to the original situation as well. I don't like that sceptical slogan of anecdotes are not evidential, or they're not data. That they absolutely are. Everything we do in psychology, when you're going down a qualitative route, you want to know about the experience of childbirth, you want to know what it's like to take public transport, you want to know what it's like to do distance learning online. You go and interview those people, you ask them certain questions you want to know, and then you look at what's going on. Starting on a wide scope like that can then form specific things like a lab study and how you would put individuals to the test. It's from anecdote to laboratory. That's how science works. So I never understand why people say anecdotes are not evidential of anything. Then to hell with eyewitness testimony. Let's scrap that, because no one's opinion or view of what happened on anything is valid. And of course there are issues with memory, but we're aware of that. So we try and take that into account and look at how people's memories work, and we do cognitive interviews. So I looked at my 50 cases, I analysed them, I found that extra call type, and what I've done since then is I've unearthed more history. I went out to Scott Rogo's archive, I found more stuff, more people have come into me with more cases, and just not many people have looked into it. I've got a colleague in France who's done his own French version of this, looking at a number of cases as well. There's been a very small sample in Italy in the 1980s, but we're finding more and more people in after-death communication research talking about telephone experiences. We recently did a survey of over 1,000 people in English, French and Spanish-speaking languages about any experience they've had they believe to be with the dead, and there's a number of telephone instances in that, awake and sleeping, and it was very positive. We're now in Dutch, German and Chinese as well, and that's gone into the journal, British Journal of Psychiatry, Open, it's gone into Explore, it's gone into a mega journal of death and dying and many others. So at the University of Northampton we're very active with these kinds of topics. I'm also writing Scott Rogo's biography. That's something that I can come back on. He was murdered in 1980. He got to the age of 40, and every year he went out to the Parapsychological Association convention to make notes on the latest research, and he would write about it as an editor for Fate magazine, so every month he had a column to write about. That one year I found in the letter correspondence the editors, or the main owners of the magazine, refused to pay for him to go, so he didn't go. He stays home that August, he goes out with friends, he was last seen at a local gay bar down the road that he'd frequented, and that was it. 2 days later, a concerned neighbour had seen by the 18th of August that his lawn sprinkler had been continuously going for 2 days. He was found slaughtered in his living room on the floor, and his murder remained a mystery. They did imprison someone for 4 years, and that got talked about in articles, but the person was released because it was all on the basis of a smudged thumbprint on the glass. But I went through his autopsy report 2 years ago, and there were things I didn't like about the trajectory of the knife wound and things. I said, there's something else at play here, there's possibly another person. Let's get the knife and his shirt and do another test of this, because no DNA testing has been done. So we tested it, nothing new has come up for DNA, it's all Scots. But the handprints and fingerprints were better. There was a handprint on the wall that was blooded, and it was 99.9% sure that we got a person who was arrested for buying drugs later that night. Fortunately, is now deceased, so they cannot serve any sentence for his murder, but it's definitely him. And that's all I'm saying, because I will write about that later in putting his life together. And the original book has been so scarce. A few more months it will be out. I've hand-typed out the original book after gaining the permission for Raymond Bayless' side of things and the rights, and I'm doing an extended postscript to talk about that original book as well. So both of them, as a sort of a volume 1 and 2 of studies, will be available. So that's it. That's my kind of freehand talk. Thank you very much. If you've got any questions, I'd be glad to take them. Any questions?
So are you dealing specifically with phone calls then? Is that what the sort of focus of it is, to do with people who experience phone calls, rather than other kinds of perhaps communication or through dreams or other methods?
For the book, I do mention parapsychology and defining it and what it looks at and what it's done and other experiences. And I have mentioned a few dream accounts. Some people said they'd had experiences of telephone calls with the deceased, but in dreams. So I do talk about them.
Right, but it's still got the telephone connection.
Still got the telephone for this. But in my general research, day to day, we're interested in any kind of experiences that people have, because we've got people working on reincarnation, mediumship, we're doing lab studies of psychic abilities,
really
anything and everything, really.
Sounds really good, yeah. So are you a sort of prominent university for researching parapsychology, or is it happening around other ones as well? Or?
It is happening around the world, but I'd say Northampton's got the largest research group there. We had one of our colleagues, Dr Richard Broughton, one of his books might even be back there, Parapsychology, the Controversial Science. And I saw a little kind of glimmer tear in his eye when he came to present the Richard Broughton Award that we do every year for postgraduate students, and we turned it into a nice glass piece, and it looked very good. But he couldn't believe he was sat around a table of some 20 parapsychologists, when he remembered it being a specific group of full-time members of staff and about 5 or 6 of us. And so it's changed, and that wasn't even all of us. Not everyone could make it, so he couldn't believe how big the research group is now, from full-time members of staff to PhD candidates. But you've got at least 12 universities in the UK that have a taught module of parapsychology, usually within a psychology curriculum, and another 12 that have got people that did a PhD in some area of this, or the doctorate, so can supervise another Masters of Philosophy or PhD in that topic as well. So down here you've got University of Greenwich, you've got Dr David Luke there as one colleague, and Chris French, Professor Chris French, still has links with Goldsmiths. He's still finishing off a PhD candidate there to completion. So we've got links down here, and all of Harry Price's stuff is still in the University of London in Senate House, and you've got the Society for Psychical Research, you've got the College of Psychic Studies.
Yeah, great.
So we're booming, and we're setting up more stuff in California as well. So the Californian Institute for Integral Studies, they have master's programs, they have doctorates, and they do have a parapsychology module, and we're trying to make more. It's growing. Thank you. Yes.
So do you know if anyone ever received these phone calls, went to a medium, and got confirmed by the spirit?
No, I don't know if it's happened in that sequence of events with them saying, they're saying that they called you or something like that, which would be good if they did and it tied the two together. But no, I've not seen it with that. But in the history of those telephones being made, when people said they were trying to make a psychic telephone, there was someone who wrote a book. There's no English translation, but it translates to Voices from Beyond by Telephone. It was written by Oscar de Argonal, who was a medium who claimed that his voices from spirit came only through the telephone. They were manipulating the electrons within the line, make it ring, and he specifically got the messages he needed to pass on to other people through the telephone, which is very, very specific. I've not seen that really in any other book. I've seen books on confessions of telephone psychics and things like that, but not mediums that claim that their own mediumship is through something external like a telephone, like it would be with a Ouija board or a table tipping or whatever else. or a pendulum, that they're using the telephone to do it. It's not an internal thing. So no, I've not seen it tied up yet, but I have heard of instances where the medium says, "Oh, they said the kitchen table. Have you moved it yet?" And it relates to some other experience they had that they thought was some sort of contact, and they're like, "How on earth could the medium have known that?" So I'm waiting. I'll wait for that one that ties up with the telephone. When I was doing cold readings and Barnum scripts, so this is where you are either reading the audience or you've got general scripts of information that people relate to themselves. It could be you've been the first thing in the morning when you get out, I'm just seeing a little bit of lower back problem that you get, and every now and then you just get a twinge and you just pause for a second before you then go off to the bathroom for a shower. And there's a gentleman coming through, and I'm guessing towards the end he went very quickly, and it's something to do with the chest area, something around here. Too generic that you want a little bit more so it can relate specifically to you. I was doing that all day at Tutbury Castle one day. It was for an event, a charity event. There were people there doing genuine readings. They were doing it for a living. There was a colleague of mine, Dr Matthew Smith, who is a parapsychologist, trying to train to do that. And then I sat there saying, I'm going to do it via what we know in psychology could be going on. And there was a guy there that really appreciated where my reading was going, even though I only know it to be just psychology and me reading the person that's in front of me. He's a very big guy, really stocky build, and he came with a very tiny wife. They were an interesting match. And I instantly thought, maybe it's for her. And I just thought, he doesn't really like the fact that he's here. He seems really nervous. And I just went, they were sat in front of me like this, and it was table after table, and I just went, I want to come to you, sir. And I didn't make up anything as though I was communicating with the dead, but I just talked about the house and things that were going on. And I just went, I just thought, this guy's a pub goer, he watches football or rugby or something, and one of his friends might have died at some point. But so I thought that might actually throw something out there for him. And so I did say, oh yeah, there's something to do with a t-shirt, not flowers or a grave. It's a t-shirt. You're going to wear a t-shirt and go somewhere, and you're going to raise a glass to something. I can hear brother. This isn't your brother, but I can hear brother as though they're like a brother to you. Your family or the friends that you pick for yourself, or the other way around, family or the friends you pick, whatever it is. And he was like, oh yeah, and then he told me a story that his friend at the pub had died, and he was going to wear a football t-shirt to honour him. But I took this forward with the reading. I went round the house in my mind, and I said, oh yeah, I'm in the kitchen, I'm looking out to the garden, I'm laughing. There's something to do with water in the garden, there's something that shouldn't be there, and I'm laughing. And as I'm doing this, not even being any specific at all, they went, how do you know we've put a toilet in the middle of the garden? I didn't say that, but you've just told me now, and all I had to say was something to do with water. Someone might put a washing machine out because it's got to go to the tip or something, or a sink's broken and you've gone and put that out, or you've left the washing basin with all the crockery in it and stuff like that. There could be a number of things to do with water, so I just put that out there as well. I could name a few things in my garden that to do with water that shouldn't be out there. So there, it kind of filled in the gap for them, and it came back to something to do with either their life or the deceased and things. I've got to do more of that soon, and I haven't done cold readings like that in Barnum scripts in over 10 years, so I need to read up on stuff like that and see how well I can do. Questions? Yes, then I'll come to you.
Sorry for my English, it's a multi-layered question. So first I'd be asking, because you mentioned that you have to define safeguards when you're establishing your protocols. I was wondering, when you write and publish your research, how do you yourself define those safeguards for your research?
Well, working for the University of Northampton, any new project that we do, we run it through ethics and also a risk assessment as well. So we have a research ethics committee that will give you approval, and it gets logged on the system, and you get a number that when you publish in a peer-reviewed paper, you can say this is our ethics number if anyone wants to check it. Parapsychology has gone a step forward though. Even in the 70s with the European Journal of Parapsychology, it was a sub-branch of the journal, because we have got the Journal of Parapsychology, it's one of many that isn't going anymore. But they used to do a thing called pre-registration, where you would actually tell them a study you were about to do and what its method was, and they would tell you whether the method was good enough before you even did it, to see whether it was worth pursuing it. So now at the University of Edinburgh, they do pre-registration there through the Coersler Parapsychology unit. So you write up what the study's going to be, you submit it for assessment, and they feedback on whether it's ready or not. So you get approval there, and also we have a Psi open data repository where you submit all your data, be it interviews or numbers, and it's there for the public to actually access and actually check that what you did, were the kinds of results that most people would expect. So we've got an ethics procedure, we've got data storage, and method approval.
So that makes the data accessible to others, others, right? But in the case of research where you need, for example, the experiment to be done again, to be verified, basically, is there any kind of other safeguards that you need to establish? For example, I worked with the consciousness research lab in Paris, and they be using hypnosis to make a repeatable mind state, and therefore there was a way for other scientists to repeat the same experiments that the neurocognitive science department was doing. So do you have these kinds of safeguards?
It would just be that with the Psi open data repository, the data is there for other people to copy it by the same methods and use the exact same sample. Or, by reading the peer-reviewed paper anyway, you can just do a replication with your own data set. But the safeguard would be that the data that's already stored in the Psi open data repository has already been approved by ethics and risk assessment anyway. So it's tidy data and it's approved data and it's already ready to go if you want to just jump straight in and do the same analysis to check that you're getting the same results.
But has it been replicated in other countries, or is it a new thing, that your project?
The telephone calls?
Yeah.
Or
has it been done before in other countries or something similar?
Well, America with Scott Rogo and Raymond Bayless. Dr Massimo Biondi was a tiny Italian sample and found the same call types.
Right, so it's interesting.
Mine being a British one but mixed with American samples, and then a French one as well where he's found that the same cases.
Yeah.
But with things like going back to the numbers and consciousness studies and looking at how people perform on a task of trying to, like, for example, the flotation tanks we're working on right now is an extension of something we call the Ganzfeld, where people lie back in a reclining chair with ping pong balls on their eyes looking at red light. And it might be that they are to perceive an image that's going to come to them and just say out loud anything that they have. And we're doing that in the flotation tanks too. What happens is everything they say gets written down, and then afterwards a computer has a pool of about 29 sets of 4 video clips, and it randomly selects one, so pool 17. So there's 4 clips. And that person, doesn't matter because it's all going to go to an independent judge afterwards as well, but that person gets to look at all 4 clips and then go, right, the second one's definitely it, in my view, that's the best one. And then I put the first one in second, third in third, and the fourth in fourth. And then the random number generator will say, which one is the target? Which one is the one to be that future event? And so it's a 25% chance. But seeing, can we actually beat this? That data will go into a repository as well, so someone could check how that was done over and over. And we're also getting an independent judge to look at the drawings and what's said, watch all 4 video clips and say, right, 2 seems to be the best one. And so that's been done since the 1970s. When you get a load of studies like those together that are all trying to achieve the same aim, we've got dozens of those, you do what's called a meta-analysis. So it's putting all the successes and all the failures together to look at the overall effect. And for parapsychology with things like that, it's done quite well. Etzel Cardenia had published a paper in American Psychologist, which is the leading journal over there, while we've got the British Journal of Psychology here. And he was talking about telepathy studies, healing studies, and looking at these overall meta-analyses and showing, look, they've all got good effects. Some are comparable to the rest of psychology, some are actually better. And I found that, even though I've heard about this replication crisis in parapsychology, you cannot demonstrate psychic abilities. Working for the last 15 years as a parapsychologist, I found better replication in parapsychology studies than I have in just general areas of psychology, where I think, well, people are like nailing jelly to a wall. Or that horrible term, juggling snot. It's just very difficult. People change every morning. The mood someone's put you in, a horrible text message you've received, a bill that's landed at your door, someone nearly bumped your car on the way to work, you found a fiver on the floor. All these pickups and put-downs throughout the day, when you then get into the lab to do a study or you're filling in a survey, it changes day by day how you're going to respond to that. So we're just so delicate in terms of an instrument to be studied. Compared to dealing with chemicals and so forth that aren't necessarily controlled by emotions in these states, or things in physics as well. I think it's very difficult trying to deal with humans and the mind when it comes to studies, but with parapsychology I think it's got pretty good replication. And I'm not trying to cheat you all there. There's a lot of failures. There's a lot of studies that have failed and they've been picked up and replicated, but there's a lot that have been successful as well. I was at a house party once where someone said to me, I get it a lot, what do you do for a living? And I think very carefully about whether I'm going to say I'm a psychologist, and they probably leave me alone because for whatever reason they have these preconceptions as to what a psychologist is, or they say, well, read my mind then. I said psychologist, not psychic. Or I say I'm a parapsychologist. And so I did on this one occasion. This lady started telling me about some of her experiences, and her husband caught wind of it, and he said, what do you do? I said, parapsychology. And he said, no, you're not. There's no such thing as that. There's no evidence for any of that. And I went, well, I do. That's what I'm paid for. That's my living. And he said, but there's no evidence for any of what you're talking about. I said, well, you're welcome to come to the University of Northampton and I'll buy you a coffee and I'll just leave you with just some of the archive. There's thousands of studies there. You know, you can read through them to your heart's content. I'll give you the printer code. You can photocopy stuff. He goes, I'm not going to do that because you don't have any of that. Come on, Deirdre, we're going. And that, you know, it was like it took his wife out of the situation, just went at that point. So angry that someone would be doing that. And that is some of the hostility that we've received for this topic. It's strange, and yet look at how many hands went up. You know, you could say, well, it's a bias because we're in Watkins bookstore, but you can go to Leicester Square, and if I just got everyone's attention and said about telephone telepathy or staring detection, hands up how many of you can relate. On average, it's about 60 to 70%. There's going to be loads of conventional explanations, but it's the fact that as humans you can relate to it. So why do we have those experiences? And on another side, how do they make you feel? How do they impact your daily existence when you have these experiences? What do they mean to you? So there's a clinical side to it and a well-being factor as well. Kinds of different remits with it. Amanda, you had one, right?
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, obviously, like we're in quite a technologically advanced society now, you know, more so than telephones. So my dad used to communicate with me through the radio in the car. I would be thinking of something and I would get a response. The song would start playing at a particular point and literally answer what I was thinking. So I'm wondering, don't look so skeptically at me. I'm wondering.
Have you been watching Christine?
Christine?
The car that came to life? Do you know?
No,
Oh, you're not seeing it.
I'm wondering what other research there is on things other than telephones, other things to do with radios and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, not that I got involved in it much. There was the ITC journal, and there's Annabella Cardoso who's written a few books on ITC, and she was pushing the ITC journal for a long while, and that brought together a number of scholars that were looking at radio and television, and they were trying to record the static on the television and get images to come through of the dead, and they would show in their books comparisons of things like that. I think Tom and Lisa Butler had done a few books like that as well. Something like that, There Is No Death and There Are No Dying was the title, and they'd show these examples. So I remember that they were trying to complement technology with some of these studies. So I did mention in this book that, who was it? Konstantin Raudova. I don't know if I saw the book around here earlier. It was a book called Breakthrough, and it was a book on EVP, and he published it with an LP, so you could hear on the record the voices he'd recorded, so as you read along you could hear these examples. After he died, people claimed in Germany and France and America that they were getting telephone calls from him. So an EVP researcher that had died. It's not unusual. There are known parapsychologists that have appeared to other people. After Harry Price, the ghost hunter, died, he appeared in countries that didn't speak English. And people had to go and tell their friends. I've seen this, there's a man with a lisp that's speaking in a different language with a limp in my kitchen, and he keeps appearing now and then, and they discovered it's Harry Price. So they got recordings of some of these because it was at the time of voicemail as well. So they got these examples, and they're very strange. They do sound like Konstantin Raudova. This is Konstantin Raudova speaking. I've called you again from the other. It's a very low and deep tone, and so someone could be mimicking it, but they thought, let's have a go at something here. We can get the computers to look at the audio-acoustical properties of Konstantin Raudova, because we've got so many recordings of him when he was alive. Let's look and see if those acoustical properties match, or whether they're different. If they're different, maybe someone's mimicking him. But they were different. But then that gives us a bit of a problem, because this one was him when he was alive, in a biological system, producing a speech pattern that's then recorded. We're suggesting that this one is a disembodied voice, and not coming from a biological system, and being generated in the throat, and through the lungs, and so forth. So why would it match? Anyway, so that at least they tried, and they wrote a paper about the idea of could we put it to the test, because we've got something here to test. But yeah, radios. I even mentioned when I was last on Uncanny, I did Uncanny USA on Radio 4, and they do the podcast. I did an episode 2 called Dad's Phone. Last episode I did, I didn't do anything to do with phones, but they brought me back for a telephone episode. And I mentioned that there's been a number of instances of electrical items playing up. Lyle Watson wrote a book after he did Supernature.
Yes. Yeah,
He did
that's
one
right.
called The Hidden Nature of Things, or The Nature of Things. And in the back, he mentioned the telephone calls from the dead by Rogo and Bayless, but he said, we've heard instances of chainsaws suddenly singing, a woman's microwave talking dirty to her, and a number of other things. So Danny on the radio said, I'll make it go ping. Just give the slogan for that. But it turned out, I said, sometimes with these things you've got to think outside the box and not inside the environment from which it's happening. They were near radio masts with high EMF outputs, high electromagnetic field outputs. Some things were suddenly acting as a radio transmitter that are not meant to be radios. And so in the certain circumstances, it might seem like a voice from the dead. It might be very different to your instance in the car with the radio, but for some people it took them by surprise, and then it was just gibberish, where they're getting dirty messages from the microwave, the chainsaws singing to them. And in other instances, like with text messages or emails, you've just got stuff lost in cyberspace. I had an instance once where I stood on a train platform waiting for a train, text message came through, and it was a girlfriend from 5 years prior saying, yeah, we'll go and see that cinema, we'll go to that theatre production, go and see that film on Friday, sounds good, and named the film. I went, are you okay? I haven't seen you in ages, and that film's been on DVD for a long time now. And she said, what are you talking about? I said, you've just sent me this. She said, I sent you that 5 years ago. I thought, where has that been in all that time? But if it was non-specific, if it didn't mention that film in a timeline, and she died in the interim, it might have appeared a bit spooky. So maybe that's how some people end up having the text messages, because there's a lag in the timeline. Someone's died, it's got lost in cyberspace, it suddenly gets to your inbox, email or text message, and it comes through. That doesn't happen with the telephone calls. That's a live interaction, which is another conundrum. It's an absolute minefield of Occam's razor, where you've got to look at each and every case on its own merits and start shaving off those layers of conventional explanations. I waffled. Any other? Hello.
So I have a question. So with the advancement of technology, obviously our telephones are no longer Nokia devices or even telephones that lift up like this one again.
You just said they're not, and you pointed at one. You're lying.
Not so commonly anymore.
Okay.
Has there been any recorded cases of individuals seeing video footage of their loved ones? So for example, FaceTime, etc., that we have now. It's possible that phenomenon may grow out of the kind of evolution of technology.
Yeah, like text messages or deceased activity on Facebook or tweets from beyond.
Instagram, was I?
Yeah.
Richard Broughton, who I mentioned earlier, who wrote the book, he mocked Scott Rogo at the time, and he made a very basic dot matrix printer book design called Faxes from Beyond, when Phone Calls from the Dead came out, and sent it to Scott, just naming it by D. Scott No-Go or something. I've seen the idea played about with. I haven't heard anyone come forward and saying they had like a video phone call or anything like that. But then it got my mind thinking to even more faults and fraud that could take place with AI. I mean, I've been listening to songs by Ozzy Osbourne that he's never sung because they've just stripped AI. Has anyone seen the latest Alien film? You have? Is anyone intending to go to see it? I don't want to kind of give you any spoilers. You are? Do you mind if I give a little spoiler? Is it going to really ruin it for you? Yeah, put your hands on your ears. Ian Holm is in it. And they've used AI to put his character back in. They've stripped his voice, they've stripped his facial recognition, and I was just like, great as an Aliens fan, but I thought, wow. And some of that is within the hands of anyone at home that's got a computer. We don't know. But, you can copy that. You can even download apps to actually retune your voice to songs now and stuff like that, and have you a pitch-perfect singer. So even when I first looked at this, I'd found websites at the time where you could send anonymous text messages. First few were free, and then you paid 50 pence a time, and it would strip out name, receiver number. It would just send you a message. So you'd end up with very creepy text messages from people. And now we're like 10, 15 years on. It's way more advanced than it was then. We're advancing so quickly with it. And so I think the room for error is far greater now in terms of how people misconstrue the experience they've had. And you can even get basic ones back to the landline telephones. You lose a son or a daughter, the phone rings, and someone goes, "Mum," and you've just lost, your child, and you go, "Oh my goodness," you're absolutely distraught, and you're not focusing on the rest of the call. That person's thinking, "What on earth? I've just dialed a wrong digit." They put the phone down, don't apologise, but for the person that received it, they've had a call from their deceased child. Hands up, how many people know someone called Mum or Dad? There's a lot of people called Mum and Dad.
There's
so
a lot of scamming going on with that one as well. I've had several.
Yeah, I can imagine there would be.
Mum, I need to speak to you. I've got a new phone number. Speak to me.
I even heard on the radio on the way down stuff happening like that with bank accounts as well, and people going on and mimicking bank accounts, and they look perfect on the phone.
Yeah.
So again, room for fraud, error, trickery, scamming people. It's massive, and yet you go back to these original cases. It's just a landline. It's very basic technology, and so it's a bit more creepy with that stuff really than I find with the more modern stuff. But if the video stuff comes through, I'll be telling you guys about it here at Watkins when it does, because those will be interesting when they come through. They're out there, I'm sure they are. But I've just got to kind of wave my hands on social media and say, "Hey everyone, I'm collecting more cases again," and I'm sure they'll crop up.
Has there been any third-party verification of a phone call from the dead? Has someone else in the room been able to verify that that person received a call from the dead person?
Yeah, there were a few instances. I didn't have many, and I had to, because the peer reviewers requested it, when I did my paper in the Journal of Parapsychology, and I list some of those post-publications down the back of this, because this is the second printing. That's why I'm advertising again. It's been out of print for 6 or 7 years, and I didn't realise how much people really wanted the book back again. It came out in 2012, so I put at least a little bit of extra information as to what's been published. And in the Journal of Parapsychology, they said, "Can you show an example where a number of people were there to verify?" Auntie Lil had called. She always does on people's birthdays, and so they pick up the landline. It's a cordless one. Everyone passed it around and spoke to Auntie Lil as they would. She's on the phone. You have a word with her. "Hi, Auntie Lil." They found out that she died a week before after the call, and there was like 4 or 5 witnesses to the fact that they'd all done the usual call with Auntie Lil. They've checked with the telephone company, and they said they found no record of that call taking place, but they had all the other ones logged. And so everyone was just baffled as to how it did. And there's a few other cases like that lurking. So there's someone at least in the other room hearing you're on the telephone, and who were you just speaking? "Oh, Harry was on the phone just then." So yeah, there's a few. That's really good when that happens, because then it backs it up, as opposed to those type 1 calls where you just sat alone. You know someone's died. It would be great if you had an experience like that. Ring, ring. And in the older cases, it would be a lower bell tone. It would be the phone closest to you and not the other ones in the house. So why? What's going on? Because the book will tell a lot more. Thank you very much, everyone, for your time. It's been wonderful to be back.